Good morning, TOK. This brings us to class number 8. Today I'm going to do a very brief run through of the peer teach model and set some expectations for what I expect from your peer teach presentations. So let's go ahead and get started. What do you know? Obviously, as we discussed in lesson 7, our peer teaching exercise is designed to prepare us for the TOK oral presentation. So I want to take a couple of minutes today and break down what my expectations are, what you need to accomplish, and go through the introduction with a sample peer teach on the introduction called Philogagging from pages 1 through 5 of Plato and a Platypus. So let's talk about what I expect from your peer teaching. There's a couple things you have to get done. First, you have to summarize the points of the chapter, including the vocabulary. We're not looking for you to read the chapter to us. First of all, you're supposed to take approximately 10 minutes. You can go up to 15 minutes. Your oral presentations will be 10 minutes each. But since there are two of you working as a team here, and some of the chapters have a lot of concepts in them, I would let you go as long as 20 minutes, but at the 20-minute mark, you're cut off. So plan on going 10 to 15, and if you go just a little over on the day, you'll be all right. But summarize those main points. Another important part, and one of the reasons why we're using Plato and a Platypus as our text, is because of the jokes. It turns out that delivering jokes is excellent practice for dealing with the stresses of live presentation. So I want you to deliver some or all of the jokes in your chapter. You can substitute if there's a joke that you find either a little offensive or you don't quite understand it, or you just think you're not able to tell it in a way that's funny, that's going to connect to your audience. You can substitute a joke of your own if it meets the same criteria, if it does the same job in the chapter. So illustrate the primary points with jokes, usually taken from the text. Make sure, where possible, that you make a connection between what's in the chapter and our previous TOK lessons or your other IB course content. If you say, this is like in English where we studied, or this reminds me of something in history, this is just like in our discussion of the areas of knowledge when, those brief kind of drop-ins, making clear and explicit, that means spelled out, explicit connections to TOK and other IB course content is going to be an important skill. And finally, when you wrap up, you should have some sort of assessment. It can be an activity, a quiz, a little homework piece. It shouldn't take more than a couple of minutes, and that is technically outside of your time as well. But you do need to, in some way, either formally or informally, just do a comprehension check. Find some way of indicating that people understood some of the points that you made in the chapter. And I will include an example of this in my sample lesson. A couple of critical pointers. Here's the rubric that I'm going to be using to assess you. I'm basically going to be looking at 5 different areas. First of all, clear speaking, clear text, clear graphics. However you're communicating, and remember, the bulk of this needs to be oral communication, you speaking to us. But your communication needs to be clear. You have to have an accurate summary of the chapter concepts and vocabulary. You need to decide which the most important points are and make sure they get emphasis. But there should be no substantial content for the chapter in terms of ideas which doesn't at least get a mention to make sure that there is a understanding of the value of each chapter. You must use humor effectively and fluently to communicate. This is building the conversational aspect. If you're not good at telling jokes, that's okay. But you should at least practice reading the jokes to others to verify that you get the pacing down. I used to do stand up, and I can tell you, you can have the funniest material in the world, and you can mumble your way through it and not really hit the emphasis points, and then it'll be horribly, horribly awful to listen to. Whereas if you pace yourself, if you hit the timing, if you know how to emphasize and to pause, you'll be able to effectively communicate. The last 2 points on the rubric are connecting to previous outside learning that I mentioned earlier, and the effectiveness of your assessment. And that's basically a yes-no. I'm not looking for you to design a complex essay prompt or anything. These are designed to be simple checks for understanding, and that could be informal. You could do a very quick Q&A. You could have a couple prepared questions and elicit open response. You can give a group grade, if you will. And grading the assessment is actually part of your peer teaching. Now, I know that no group project is ever completely equal. It's the nature of education and the nature of humans working in groups that exact splits of content, skill, and time rarely are achieved. But I'm looking for each partner to do approximately 50% of the speaking. Any other work, graphics, video, designing the assessment, or whatever, this should also be split pretty evenly between the two partners. Grading the assessment is also a requirement. So I'm looking for that grading to be whatever your assessment is, however you formulate that assessment. I'm going to be looking for a roughly equal participation. For example, if you just do a quick oral quiz, okay, somebody tell me the definition of this term. One person should be asking the questions, and another one might be observing who has the answers, who has their hand up, who looks confused, ask follow-up questions, and so on. Okay, and with very little further ado, let's move on to our sample peer teach on the introduction, also called Philogagging. So here is a sample peer teach on Philogagging from Plato and a Platypus. Now, as a basic overview, the chapters of Plato and a Platypus Walk into a Bar follow the same basic pattern. The chapter pattern starts with a dialogue between two fictional Greek philosophy students or philosophers, Tasso and Dimitri. In Philogagging, Dimitri is asking some questions about the nature of the world, and Tasso is doing his best to respond. Dimitri asks if Atlas holds up the world, what holds up Atlas? Well, Atlas stands on the back of a turtle. What does the turtle stand on? Another turtle. And what does that turtle stand on? My dear Dimitri, it's turtles all the way down. This is a concept of infinite regression, the idea that behind every explanation there is a further explanation. And it introduces us to the idea that big questions often have strange or unsatisfying answers. The authors follow up the dialogue with text that's designed to quickly connect the dialogue to ideas in philosophy. In the introduction, they talk about how the Tasso and Dimitri dialogue illustrates the philosophical notion of infinite regress. And this brings us to something called a first cause. The first cause is the idea that creation somehow inherently implies a creator, and that creator behind him, that it's creators all the way down. And when you follow it to its logical extension, you get the first cause, the uncreated creator. Following this text, we have a contrasting aside. You see the orange text in the standard copy of the text. These little asides usually provide counterpoints or extensions, additional information, and the first one includes an important idea. It says, if you find that infinite regress is getting you nowhere fast, you might consider the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. As John Lennon put it in a slightly different context, before Elvis, there was nothing. The idea of creatio ex nihilo is that you can, in fact, get something from nothing, that you can have not an uncreated creator, but an uncreated creation. So it is an alternative philosophical explanation to the problem of first causes. It's not enough to just read the jokes or even to read the text. It's important to break down the analysis. What is the idea that these jokes illustrate? The first couple jokes are to introduce us to this idea of philogagging, which is the idea that real life leads us to questions, questions lead us to jokes, and jokes, in a surprising way, inform philosophy. That philosophy and jokes share a similar structure and perhaps even a similar purpose. The first joke is about is in the form of empiricism, just to demonstrate this concept. And the second, the argument from analogy, goes into more detail, actually giving us an example of an argument from analogy which applies to the idea that jokes represent in some way real philosophical ideas. And our first joke comes to us from the School of British Empiricism. Morty comes home to find his wife and his best friend Lou naked together in bed. Just as Morty is about to open his mouth, Lou jumps out of the bed and says, "Before you say anything, old pal, what are you going to believe, me or your eyes?" The implication here is that obviously, when presented with direct sensory experience, there's a TOK connection in terms of ways of knowing, with sense perception, that Morty will believe his eyes. But Lou is making the claim upon friendship that we know your eyes can deceive you, so stop for a minute and listen to me. The fact that this argument also helps Lou quite a bit is perhaps an analysis best left to the student. The next joke is actually very old and is a favorite of mine for explaining the argument from analogy. The idea that a metaphor, a situation where two things are analogous to two other things, that they have some kind of similar symbolic relationship with one another, can share reality. Is pretty critical and informs my educational strategies quite a bit. I often will try and use analogies and examples. You can spot these because it'll be this is as if, or this is very similar to, wouldn't this be like X, Y, or Z? So here we have one of the classic examples of the argument from analogy, that the representation of one situation can tell us something meaningful about another situation. And now our joke, argument from analogy. A 90-year-old man went to the doctor and said, "Doctor, my 18-year-old wife is expecting a baby." The doctor said, "Let me tell you a story. A man went hunting, but instead of a gun, he picked up an umbrella by mistake. When a bear suddenly charged at the man, he picked up the umbrella, shot the bear, and killed it." The man says, "Impossible. Someone else must have shot that bear." The doctor says, "My point exactly." Now, Cathcart and Klein, in their further text, go on to explain that different kinds of questions lead to different kinds of jokes. And those different jokes really lead to different schools of philosophy. That what separates one school of philosophy from another is the nature of the kind of questions with which it engages. And these form different schools of philosophy. They give some examples. It's not critical at this point to record all the examples, as the remaining chapters are, in fact, examples of those schools of philosophy. So don't worry if you didn't record all in your notes, all of the schools of philosophy mentioned at the end of the introduction. And that brings us to the end of the introduction. I'd like to end with a quick assessment. We're just going to do a vocabulary review. Obviously, if you're watching this on your own, you can pause the video, jot down the notes, the letters for the corresponding numbers. It's just a simple matching of these four terms. If you are watching en masse, if you are in a group today or watching with a peer, not a bad idea to see to just call out your answers, see if you agree with one another, and then we will review the answers together in just a moment. The first term we have is first cause. The second is argument for creatio ex nihilo. We have the argument from analogy, and we have philogagging. Our definitions: the connection of real life to questions, questions to jokes, and jokes to philosophy. B, the idea that metaphorical relationships can give insight to real questions. C, the idea that the fact of creation requires a creator. Or D, the idea that you can get something from nothing, uncreated creation. Take a moment and do your matching, and we'll check your results. Well, all right. I hope very much that your answers correspond with mine. A first cause is the idea that the fact of creation requires a creator. The argument for creatio ex nihilo, my Latin is terrible, I apologize, is the idea that you can get something from nothing, or uncreated creation. The argument from analogy is the idea that metaphorical relationships can give insight to real questions, as we saw in the elephant joke. And philogagging is the central conceit, the central idea of this text, that there is a connection of real life to questions, questions to jokes, and jokes to philosophy. And therefore, jokes can be an effective tool. This is implied that jokes can be an effective tool in understanding philosophy, as they help us match real life questions to philosophy. I hope this has been useful for you. We're going to wrap it up here today, and I look forward very much to our next lesson. Have a wonderful afternoon. Wow, I can't believe I signed off and wished you well, and I totally forgot the final note that I wanted to make. I want to remind you, if you have not checked your email or spoken to Ms. Smith, that February 8th, Saturday at 1:30 in the library, we will be having our first media study. It runs from 1:30 to 4. That's time for us to do the complete media study, but it is critical that we get there on time. Please, please, please. Because if we take half an hour to get everybody there and another half hour to get set up and going, then we're really not going to have enough time to effectively answer all the questions that you're going to have. And if by some magic we do manage to just breeze through it and we're all on a sympathetic frequency and we manage to knock it out quickly, I have no problem with letting you guys go early if we get the work done. So 1:30, February 8th, Saturday in the Hillcrest Library. Very much look forward to seeing you then.